Good morning, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We may be small but mighty this morning. Selena, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. I am Terry Watson. I'm the policy advisor here at Building Codes Division, and we are here to go over all the information we have collected over, has it been a year? I think maybe it has been a year that we've been working on this information. So it looks like we have Jonathan here from City of Albany, and we have Joel Osborne as well. And I think we might have a few others that will be joining us maybe a little bit later. So we do have a lot of material to cover. So Selena, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay. Yeah, I hope we have more participants joining in. It seems like kind of a small group, given how many things we have to go over and discuss. But I guess we can put them into the record, and it will be available as a recording for folks after the fact, as well as all the documents that go with it. So, so to start off with, first off, just reporting back about the work groups that we had. So we had several work groups that got together to decide what information should be in the surveys. First, we did one for local jurisdictions, then we did one for design professionals, and then we did one for contractors. And we'll get back to discussing the results of the design professional and contractor surveys after we go over the two other work groups that we had. One was to talk about licensing, and the other one was to talk about the overlap between building departments and the utilities. So let's talk about that one first. So with that one, we had representatives from PGE and Northwest Natural, as well as several building officials and I believe contractors. There was a lot of discussion about the handoffs between, or again, those overlapping areas between the utilities and building departments. And most of it seems that most of that process works pretty well. But there was some discussion about, there are times when utilities are getting requests to energize and they're not sure that there's been a final inspection or an approval. And so there was some talk about whether there would be some ways to put in place some electronic processes to help that along. And so some of the recommendations from the work group were that maybe that jurisdictions could do one of two things. One would be potentially having some kind of automated process wothen when there's a final approval on a new service or a temp power service or on something that the utilities need to know about, an email could go to the utilities, right? That something could be automated so that as an inspector finals that would go directly to the utilities, or as a second way that maybe there would be kind of like a batch job out of an electronic system where at the end of each day, all of the final approved inspections for that affect the utilities could be forwarded in a spreadsheet, say, to the utilities, who could then load that into their systems or have access to it if and when they're getting requests to energize. So that was kind of like a best practice thing that came out of that discussion, or a potential thing that folks could be including in their electronic systems. Then there was also a fair amount of discussion about especially from PGE, about what work required permits. So evidently, whenever the meter base is moved on an electrical meter, an alarm goes off at the utilities, and they're finding a lot of times that when they investigate that there may not have been a permit pulled. And so the building officials at that meeting, and then we had a follow-up meeting with Keith, our chief electrical inspector, and he kind of confirmed that, 99.99% of the time, any work that is moving the meter base requires a permit. And so there was some discussion about, so one thing is that with everybody, as we're proceeding to having everybody online, the utilities should certainly have access to being able to look up an address and find out whether a permit has been pulled at that location. Also, there were suggestions that the utilities could forward the information about alarms and about the address at which that happens to a local building department, so that they could also check and see if a permit has been pulled and follow up if there hasn't been. So there was that discussion. There was also some discussion about the request to energize form. There was a little bit of kind of confusion about when that could be used. There were some kind of thought that it was only for emergencies. It's not only for emergencies, it's for, yes, for emergencies, as in there's a fire or a flood or something that requires immediate action to be taken on an electrical service, but it's also for remote locations for convenience, basically. The signing supervisor has to kind of fill out the details on it. However, there's, the form itself requires that a permit number should be entered on the form, and it should be sent to the utility as well as to the local building department. And so kind of some of the follow-up recommendations that were included on this in the email about this meeting were that a utility should not be energizing if there is no permit number, or they can certainly, unless it's an emergency, right? And in that case, they should use their discretion. If it's if there's been a windstorm or an ice storm, they may want to go ahead and energize without that permit number. But for other types of circumstances, for convenience, they might, certainly would want to have that. And that was kind of the extent of the work group. It was a good discussion. Oh, actually, that's not true. There's one more thing. There was also several recommendations and kind of suggestions that that perhaps that video inspection technology might be a good use for some of the types of things, some of the current green tag inspections, that might be something that we want to do further investigation on as to whether that would be an appropriate type of inspection for kind of a minor label type video inspection. So we didn't get into the specifics of how that would work, but there were definitely several suggestions that might be a good usage of video inspection technology. So that may be something that we want to work group in the future. And I see we've got a few more folks. Terry, do you want to go ahead and have people do introductions? Maybe walk us through that before we go into more detail here.
Sure. Let's see. Natalie with City of Portland joined us. And we had Jonathan from City of Albany and Joel with City of Eugene. I'm also sending a couple emails to the people that RSVP'd so that hopefully they'll be joining us soon, because those were the utilities as well. Selena.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. And those of you, please feel free to jump in and ask questions or join in discussion at any point in time. No, I know Zoom meetings are kind of awkward to get in there, but certainly you can raise your hand, put something in the chat, or even just jump into the discussion. I don't mind if anybody interrupts me at all. So, alrighty. So that any questions or further thoughts about kind of what we've outlined and what the materials we provided about the utility work group? And again, that we held that a lot at the request of the utilities. They were excited to have some of that discussion about the processes. I think we early on found that a lot of their concerns about the overlap between utilities and working with local jurisdictions did not have to do with building department processes. They had more to do with public works or engineering processes and the overlap in the right of way. And we had to clarify that was not something that we could discuss in this work group, because this is a building codes division, building department work group. So that, that kind of really narrowed down the scope of the discussion. But I think it was productive and useful and helpful to the utilities. There was one other thing, which was that there was that I think it was brought up by one of the building officials that Northwest Natural has some useful information on kind of the utility processes. It seems that they may not have a brochure, but maybe there's a link to their website. And there was a suggestion that, again, as a best practice thing, perhaps that we could, that local jurisdictions, and then in e-permitting, we may be able to do that as well, have some links to those materials on the utility sites to help contractors kind of know what the expectations are for the utilities in that overlap between building departments and utility departments. So I think that's a pretty comprehensive wrap up of what happened with that work group. Again, any questions about that, comments, thoughts, follow-ups? Okay, I'm going to take that as going, gone then. All right, so the other work group that to discuss was we had a meeting of to talk about licensing. So that was local jurisdictions, a couple of contractors, and us at Building Codes Division. And we discussed, first off, a lot of the discussion revolved along the access to licensing data in electronic systems and the difficulty of gathering that data and refreshing that data and keeping it up to date. So there was a lot of discussion about technically what would be possible in terms of those loads. Several people mentioned that it would be great to have real-time data. That is true. However, especially given that there's Building Codes Division has its licensing system, CCB has its licensing system, and then if you use architects, engineers, landscape contractors, they all have their own licensing systems. And in order to have real-time access to that data, you would have to make an interface or a link to those systems, and that's too many systems. That would be cost and time prohibitive and too much maintenance to try to be able to keep a real-time linkage to that. So the next question was then, how do jurisdictions get a licensing load? And the first question was whether at e-permitting we could provide our licensing load to local jurisdictions. And unfortunately, because of the way in which we have it both formatted and collected, and we also run scripts against it in order to be able to make our load, that is not a viable alternative. However, so then we moved on to kind of the next discussion of then what's the alternative to that. So right now, Building Codes Division is publishing its data at oregon.data.gov. And so that could be a centralized, and that's a place in which you can grab that data, hit APIs off of that data, do a web service off of it. So we talked about, BCD has it there, CCB and the other licensing agencies do not. So we, in the follow-up, are reaching out to the different agencies to see if we can encourage them to expedite the process of getting their data to oregon.data.gov. And we actually met with CCB yesterday, and they are willing to post their data also to that site. And we are going to kind of put them in touch with folks at the DCBS tech folks who are responsible for moving the BCD data onto oregon.data.gov to, provide some pointers to them on how they get their data up to that. So we're hopeful that they will be posting their data there within the next, 3 to 4 months. So we can kind of do a follow up and keep people posted as that data gets there. And then once with them doing that, we're going to reach out to the landscape contractors, the architects and the engineers. We currently in e-permitting get loads from them. Some of them I think we have to go get, but we will see whether, again, there's an option to get them to post their data to oregon.data.gov and provide some assistance to them. So at least the licensing data would be in one centralized location, available for jurisdictions to grab and put into their systems, and also available just to have one place to go to for a check. One of the other discussion though was that data will be 24 hours old, right? So there is still going to be, in the sense of, you have to, in order to do a data dump like that, you have to pull all of the data out of a system and then load it onto the system. And that's something that generally is going to be something that's probably going to happen in the middle of the night, right? So that you don't slow down your production environments for the data.gov site. And so it's going to probably be a scheduled job that would happen in the middle of the night, and it's only going to happen once. So jurisdictions are still probably going to be hearing from folks who say, I just renewed my license, or my license is showing active. And in those cases, that still just requires a manual check on the website of either BCD or CCB to make sure that, that the data that you have in your system is indeed up to date. And that's probably the best that we can do in terms of that issue of timeliness. There was also a clarification from, and this I probably mostly affects us at e-permitting, from CCB, that we didn't have to worry about their insurance expiration dates, but that's a piece of data that gets updated separately from active or inactive status. And sometimes that's been causing our licenses to be considered inactive. And CCB clarified that if it shows active on their site, that's the bottom line. We don't need to worry about any of those other points of data in the system. So Carrie, did you have something you wanted to jump in and say, or?
Oh, I was just going to say that Larry Buchanan from Northwest Natural has joined us. So I don't know if you want to go back and just give a quick recap of utilities, or if you want to do it a little later, or.
I'm sure, Larry, we went over a little bit about the work group that you guys participated in, and just kind of talked about some of the lessons from that. A lot of it on the PGE side on it, probably more. I think there was more discussion about, some of the BCD forms concerning energization, what required a permit, what didn't. But for both of the utilities, kind of the two kind of recommendations that came out of that work group were that, if possible, with electronic systems, as we're implementing them and as we look to the future, trying to find some mechanism, whether it's a daily export of a spreadsheet that goes to the utilities of finalized inspections for new gas or electrical services or alterations, so that you all have better, more timely, access to that information, or coordination of that information. And also talking about linking to, I think we'd had some discussion about maybe brochures, but maybe you all don't have brochures, but maybe providing links on local government websites to your websites for requirements that folks might have, so that the contractors know where to get the information that they might need about, working with and scheduling inspections, to make sure that they know where to place the gas meter or the electrical meter, right? Or that kind of information. So I think those were the kind of overall recommendations for that type of stuff. And then there were some specific things that had to do more with, again, PGE and electrical utilities. So that's kind of an overview. Did you have anything to add or follow up on that?
I just think for our side, it's some of the key things, for us is just be able to validate the credentials for the folks doing the testing, right? Like you said, one consistent point for getting the information on the inspections. So just how that info is received, the other piece too is, for us, is we have business processes that'll impact. So we just need to kind of know the front end of that. And then when it comes down to the communication thing for the contractor or the customer, we wouldn't send brochures out. You're correct. It would be better to have something on our website to point them to, or some links to point them to. So, yeah. Because there was conversations on how that electronic information was going to come across. And there was conversations on, is it going to be an app? So then it goes down into the weeds. I won't get into it, who's responsible for that app and all that kind of stuff. So I won't get into the weeds, but I think that's part of the conversation we're having on our side. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think as we talked through those different technological solutions, I thought, and but maybe that there was a little bit of more gravitation towards the idea of that export of the data of the from the building inspection side of things, just because that doesn't require a single product, right? That
Exactly.
or two different products, right? It's a spreadsheet, or it's a a consolidated set of data that can be then is more flexible, perhaps, right?
Yep.
And doesn't require necessarily somebody to develop it. So it's a little bit platform neutral to be able to do that, and hopefully is something that, as long as it has the key points of data, is able to be loaded into your system or PGE system, and readily pulled out of a variety of different electronic systems.
Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly on our end. We had conversation late last week, kind of going through the different documents that were provided around the process. So that's kind of where we landed on our side too. So, yeah.
And the other thing, I mean, long term, one of the, since the goal of this rulemaking and the bill that was passed was that by 2025, every building department within the state of Oregon should be on its own electronic platform, capable of doing a series of different things, one of which is having a lookup. And so there should be also the ability to be able to go to an address search and see whether a permit has been pulled and see what their inspection results. And
Yeah.
I know that's not ideal, right? It'd be better to have some kind of load that gives you that information that you could load into your system. But having access to that data and knowing that it's there is also, I'm sure, something that would be helpful.
Yeah, that was actually brought up with our team too. Definitely whatever it becomes, the daily communication, but also, yes, be able to go back, because that was the part that we do have. If we have to go back and do a validation, we want to make sure we have access to that information. So, yeah, perfect.
And that's one of the things that long term I would love to discuss with this committee as a rulemaking thing. Obviously, we have a series of jurisdictions that are participating in e-permitting, and a number of jurisdictions that will be doing their own electronic system. But one of the things that I've always thought would be a nice thing would be to have kind of a contractor's hub, where a contractor could go in, or a member of the public or a utility could go in and put in an address and be directed to the appropriate jurisdiction, because it's not always so easy for folks to know, especially in the metro area or the metro areas, who serves a particular address, right? And so potentially the idea of just having something that gets people to the correct building department jurisdiction to be permitting, or to, City of Eugene's website, or wherever it is that they need to be for that particular address's services. That's one of the things that I also think could be an exciting outcome potentially of this process. Alrighty, so anything else about the utility work group? Nope. Okay, then we'll switch back to the licensing work group. So again, that we were in the process of discussing, what could we do. Getting all of the data at oregon.data.gov is the first step, so we certainly, having CCB and BCD data there and available for any jurisdiction to pull will be a big step forward. And then if we can augment that with also landscape contractors, architects, engineers, that should pretty much run the gamut of things that jurisdictions might want to load into the system. However, the one downside to that site for the long term, which we had some discussion with CCB about, is that we're not going to be able to publish, or should not be publishing onto that website email addresses, which, for most folks, you're going to want email addresses in your system. And so we had some discussion about, is there another way to get email addresses associated with licenses to local jurisdictions? I think currently most of the participants who are not on e-permitting and us in e-permitting are currently getting their addressing data through FTP. Is that true of those of you who have electronic systems who are participating today? Do you know?
Yes, that's how we get ours. We get it weekly from BCD and from CCB.
Okay, into your FTP, and that's working okay for you as it is?
Yeah, we have an automated way to reconcile with our current contact information and just update our current contacts. So we do the full download of the data and we try and reconcile it, add new, update existing.
Yeah, that's how we do things as well. Yeah, the FTP and potentially, so you all, folks may want to continue using that because you're, I'm sure, putting email addresses from that into your system, I'm assuming. I know we do.
I actually don't think we do. I think that we only update existing contact information where we already have email addresses from folks. And some of that has to do with the particular business entity might want a different person to be the point of contact than
Sure.
what the license is associated with.
Sure. Okay, well then that's good. Then if that's, if folks are not as concerned about email addresses potentially or are dealing with it in a different way, then being able to pull the data off of Oregon.data.gov, that's a mouthful, then that may not be as much of an issue. The other thing we discussed was long-term, potentially if folks wanted to pull the data from that site, but also wanted email addresses from the licensing entities, that they could get a separate file, perhaps of a spreadsheet on a monthly basis that just had license number and email and be able to upload that. The advantage being that you wouldn't necessarily have to FTP something like that. That might be something that you could email, right? As opposed to having to go through the FTP process to dump, more of a database worth of stuff. So that was some of that discussion. And I guess we can see how things unfold as more folks are building their own licensing loads.
Selena, can I interrupt for a second? Because
Yes.
wasn't it the city of Portland that had the concerns about the email due to fraudulent licensing? Is that correct?
Well, there was some discussion. Yes, thank you. There was some discussion about how to deal with, fraudulent use of licenses in electronic permitting systems. That it seems that potentially, having online applications increases the likelihood that somebody's going to do something inappropriate. I don't know if it actually increases the likelihood. I think there are people still did fraudulent things, applying directly to building departments, but because it's a little bit more anonymous, although you do have to register for a site, there was some discussion about that. And we kind of shared what we do in e-permitting, and that's where the email conversation came up, in that whenever somebody associates a license to a public user account, an email goes to that licensee, to whatever email address is on record, saying, hey, somebody just associated your license to their account. We've hardly ever had issues with it, but we have a couple of times had people call into our help desk and say, hey, I didn't authorize that user to be adding my information to their account, and so we've removed it, dealt with that person, or occasionally a jurisdiction has identified something comparable. And again, there's mechanisms for that. They've created quite an audit trail of like who they were, the fact that they've associated the license, it goes on to a permit. There are mechanisms for either both enforcement or just canceling permits if it's an outright mistake versus somebody trying to do something fraudulent. But for us, that's where the email addresses have been helpful. So does anybody else have a similar process electronically or a different process electronically for dealing with potential issues of fraud? No. Okay. Yeah. And obviously there's, inspectors are out there checking when they're out doing inspections. There are multiple ways of verifying who's doing the work. And so again, I don't know that actually having an electronic system makes it any more likelihood that people are doing things they shouldn't be doing. But it is good to have those mechanisms. And the other recommendation of the work group was try to encourage both CCD and BCD to keep email addresses up to date in their licensing systems for just these types of circumstances. And BCD, I think there was some, Graham, the licensing manager, was talking about some ways that they might be able to do that on renewals. So they currently do keep email addresses, but there might be a way to prompt licensees to try to keep their addresses, email addresses up to date. And we can certainly also talk to CCB a little bit about that process as well. There was also some discussion within the licensing group about, and these are things that perhaps, you know, we can kind of put out there as best practices about to what degree in electronic systems do you have to lock down access to applications based upon license requirements. So I think the city of Portland particularly had brought up that currently their system is trying to, you know, only give access based upon the scope of a contractor's license. And, you know, certainly within the electrical contracting world, I think there are like 20 different contractors' licenses. So that's very complicated to try to program that in. And then there was some discussion from e-permitting and Clackamas County, Matt, also that on our systems, rather than getting quite as specific as that, you are required to have an electrical contractor's license to be able to pull an electrical permit, or a plumbing business license to pull a plumbing permit, et cetera. But we don't lock it down to the scope of work. So that is, you know, ultimately the licensee's responsibility to make sure that they're working within the scope of their license. B, that's something that can be checked as you're, you know, whether it's a permit tech or an inspection, you know, looking at what contractor's license is on the permit and what work is being done, and verifying the two things coordinate. So that we had some discussion about that. And out of that discussion also came a request for BCD to develop kind of a cheat sheet, or at least a somewhat of a guide to the scope of work, or the scope of, you know, what's allowed under the various contracting licenses. We do have that available on our website, but there are so many licenses. And so we are looking to kind of consolidate just the contractor's information, the contractor license information, and a little bit about like the signing supervisor requirements, and put that into a document. I'm hoping that we can actually have that ready for the next meeting of the Oregon Permit Tech Association, which I think is in November. And then maybe also put that on our website and send that out to local jurisdictions to have as a resource that could be helpful in you know, doing those checks. So any questions about that? Comments? Nope. Okay. Alrighty, and trying to think, I think there was just on that licensing thing, I think there was one more little bit of stuff to go over with that in terms of best practices. Just making sure I'm not missing anything. I don't think so. So some of that stuff, again, we'll work at having available as resources for folks. Okay, so that was kind of the two major work groups that we had, the utility overlap and the licensing discussion. And then we had several work groups to develop the two surveys that we're going to discuss. We have previously discussed the local jurisdiction survey that got done, that we put together. I think the whole RAC kind of worked on putting together a survey of local government to kind of assess the situation of, you know, what's going on, what people are doing electronically. I'm not going to go into detail, but I'll just kind of highlight that, you know, we found that most of the jurisdictions in the state are using have some kind of electronic permitting software in place, and that those who do not don't, either because of resources, whether that's money, staff time, internet connection. That was one set of kind of concerns or barriers that were identified. The other was that a lot of some of those jurisdictions, mostly smaller jurisdictions, you know, felt that their customers either didn't do much or preferred to do things in person, or that they also valued the ability of having that in-person contact with their customers. That was kind of another theme that was identified for folks who didn't have electronic processes. Within that, also in the local jurisdiction survey, clearly, there's a lot of stuff, permits and inspections online. There's a little bit less in terms of what's going on, or fewer jurisdictions that are doing electronic plan review. So I know that from the e-permitting, from our experiences, that has been, all of our jurisdictions are doing permitting and inspections, and most of them accept electronic plans, but not everybody is doing electronic markup or has figured out their internal processes for doing that. So with that, let's segue over to the design professional survey that was sent out. I don't know that I think everybody should have a copy of that, and I hope that people had a chance to kind of look at that. I personally found some things pretty interesting. Obviously, we had mostly we got responses from architects. So we got a lot of responses. 99% of them were from the architects. And with them, there's a lot of online activity, right? So most of the people, most of the architects said that they mostly did online submittals, right? So there were only 4% who never did, 13% that sometimes did, and 10% that half the time, but 3/4 of the folks always or mostly did electronic submittal of their plans. So that was kind of an interesting tidbit. And it was by region. It was interesting to me also that things were fairly consistent in terms of, that where people were doing business, that it wasn't that in some jurisdictions they were more likely to be putting, or some areas of the state they were more likely to be submitting electronically than others. It was pretty consistent that they were actually either always doing it or not always doing it, if that makes sense, folks. And actually, pretty consistent numbers in terms of that. So that was super interesting. Most folks it said they most commonly were doing online uploads, mostly PDFs. Again, no surprises in that. And then I think probably the most interesting portion of this survey was obviously the feedback that folks had about their experience and what they would like to see with electronic plan review. So we asked some questions about, currently when they're submitting plans online and they're being required to resubmit, why? And so the most common thing was that the files were not named properly. And as we looked at suggestions, as we get further into the survey, that was one of the things that was asked of local jurisdictions is, could there be some more consistency across jurisdictions and simplification potentially of the naming standards, right? Or of also how the files are uploaded. One thing is that, sometimes they're too large, or they're not, they're locked or secured. Again, some better direction on how to upload and some more consistent direction between jurisdictions so that they're not going from place to place and having to navigate completely different requirements and completely different, change their sets of plans per each individual jurisdiction. And I think that was kind of identified time and time again. There were some suggestions, and I'm very glad to see Joel here, because the City of Eugene's system was identified by a number of people as one that they had a very good experience with. I took a quick look at what you have there, and it seemed to me that one of the things that stood out to me as probably why folks like it, but I'd like to hear from you too, was that you have pretty good directions for folks on the website about what they need to do in uploading the plans. But I don't know, Joel, if you've gotten some feedback or have some, have any experience with what people say they like about your system.
Well, it's interesting because I spent my career prior to working for the city as an architect working in the city of Eugene. And so I know the local community reasonably well. Generally, I think that people like that the system just seems to make sense. It's pretty straightforward, and it's pretty predictable. There aren't a lot of hoops to jump through. When things should be simple, they're usually pretty simple. And the biggest complaint that we have is definitely file naming. We try not to make it complicated, but we made one critical decision, which is we require applicants to submit their files one drawing sheet per file. And that is to ease the replacement process that happens through plan review and supplemental information submittals, so that they're not constantly submitting bundles of everything. And that we're not responsible for collating into a one big PDF which sheet is current. We want them to do that. So once you have one sheet per file, you have a lot of files that need to be named. And that's definitely an issue for some folks. A lot of the design professionals use software, though, where they've already named all their sheets, they've numbered all their sheets, and they just push a button and all the files come out named. And the only thing that we do that people really then still don't like is we want them to have a prefix for a sort order, so that we see the list of documents in the order that they intend.
So, I mean, one of the things coming out of this that I see that I think would be useful, but I don't know how realistic is or how difficult it would be to put together a work group of local jurisdictions and architects and potentially some contractors to discuss, whether there's some best practice guidance that we could put together to try to increase the consistency across jurisdictions about the naming conventions, the uploading conventions, and the process of that process for electronic plan review. Does that sound like something, what do people think about that?
I think that'd probably be productive. I find that mostly when you're dealing with design professionals, it's really not as big of an issue for file naming, because there's practice is pretty consistent about how sheets are numbered and sheets are named, and there's really not a whole lot of variation. Most design professionals are familiar with the National CAD standard in some flavor or another, and so things are at least pretty understandable without a lot of effort. But there's the never-ending stream of one-off applicants who are doing something sketched out on a blank piece of paper, or even residential folks who do quite a bit of stuff but have never had that kind of formal background where they've picked up what the practice is outside of their personal work. And so that's where the biggest inconsistencies are for us. And I think that will be the hardest folks to build consensus with.
Agree. I mean, I think I understand that feedback, but on the other hand, this particular survey did come from the design professionals, from the architects, and there's a lot of feedback saying, please make things more consistent between jurisdictions. If you look at where people do business, most of them clearly do business throughout the state, right? So they're touching multiple systems, and that's what they're saying is every place they go to has different naming requirements, different uploading requirements, and that it becomes a lot of time and effort on their side of things to try to keep track of all of those different ways of doing things. And I get that that's going to be a little bit difficult, because already all of us have already kind of invested time and effort into designing our own way of doing things. But I think it's probably worth it to try to see if we can make some effort in doing that. Natalie, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. And I don't want to get into the weeds here. I can't speak for much, unfortunately. I don't work with our permitting services group, and we were trying to get someone to attend that could speak more to our processes here in Portland. But I was I hear what you're saying about the architects getting consistency for those folks who can do this easy enough, and I am totally supportive of that. And Joel, you were starting to mention the one-offs, and so maybe this isn't the right place for this conversation, but that is something that Portland is really struggling with, is all of the people who are doing one project maybe in their whole life. And I'm just curious, are there exceptions to this, single page and naming standards in Eugene at all? That is something that we're really struggling with right now in Portland.
I'll just say that it's a never-ending struggle for the staff that have to process those things to go back to the customer and try and get them to rename things. We try to have folks rename things, but on occasion, staff will rename the files for them and submit them on that person's behalf. So that does happen. I know that Lane County, the county that Eugene is in, started just accepting all the files and having their staff rename every single file. And so, file naming is a big deal if you want people to understand what the file is. And you either have the government entity do it and you have to pay for that, or you do it yourself. And when people sort of have that choice put to them, they tend to want to do it themselves. Not that we have a fee for that. I'm not saying that like that's not we're going to give you a surcharge because we had to name your files. I just see that that's another sort of piece of labor that ends up getting built into the services that are provided.
Well, and I do think that could be one of the benefits of providing a little bit more. Well, I guess even for those one-off folks, it's just how much documentation can you provide? Some level of consistency at least could help have us all create or have available maybe some more straightforward, kind of conventions to help those folks who are trying to struggle through as a first-time person understanding what they need to do for this. But I mean, you're right. I don't think that's it's pretty hard to solve that for the folk, and especially if they're not technologically savvy, right? To get them to understand what they have to do to navigate through that. So, but I do think that would be I think it's something that we should have some one or several meetings about as we're looking towards the best practice guide, and also kind of as it becomes a mandatory portion to accept electronic plans. People need to be thinking about what does that how do you navigate this portion of things as well. So any other thoughts about that, about standards, naming? Anything else that people saw in the survey that they'd like to talk about for the design professionals? No. Okay. Well, again, I think that's something, there are not only some best practice things to talk about and to kind of address in terms of some of the concerns that were certainly raised by the architects in those survey results, but also, again, potentially some rulemaking that goes along with defining perhaps what the terms are that go along with what constitutes electronic. So, but with that, let's move over to the construction contractor survey that we did. On this one, a little bit less uniform in that we had 76% of the participants were general contractors, 24% were the trade contractors. Again, a pretty good kind of cross-section of folks doing business in different parts of the state. Kind of some, most people were doing some business in urban areas and in rural areas, kind of a combination of the two. We had more residential contractors, but still about a quarter who did both commercial and residential. Only about 8% that were exclusively commercial contractors. And we had pretty good representation in the state, motly metro and the Willamette Valley, but then a pretty good number from the coast Southern Oregon, Central Oregon, less in Eastern Oregon, or work in Eastern Oregon at the boards. This one was a little bit more surprising. Some of the data was a little bit more surprising to me in terms of, so we, in terms of the online activity of the contractors, we had 37% of them answered that they never apply for permits online, 22% that said they sometimes do. And then we had, like 35% of folks who say they do it most of the time or always, or a combination of those two. So that was kind of surprising. So the online application process, and I suspect that of those contractors who are doing it always and most of the time, most of those are probably trade contractors. I know at least any permitting that our vast majority of online application are coming from the electrical and plumbing contractors, as well as mechanical, residential mechanical primarily. But again, that was pretty consistent in terms of where they were never doing it, sometimes doing it, or always doing it, was consistent throughout the state. So it seems more like that's personal preference versus the access to the ability to apply online potentially. Similarly, a lot of, the numbers were pretty consistent for paying for permits online. There's, a good core of about a third, 35% of people who are doing that most and all of the time. And then there's like 50% of the folks who are, or actually closer to 60% of the folks who are either never doing it or only doing it occasionally. So, and again, that's hard to know how much of that is access to the process or personal, personal preference. So we asked a little bit about what they preferred to do, whether it was online or in person. And that answer was pretty interesting because 70% of folks said that they preferred to do it online and 30% they preferred to do it in person. And kind of the answers for why were not too surprising. Those who want to do it online say it's more convenient, easier, faster, and efficient. But those who don't want to either are uncomfortable with technology. Some folks said it actually took longer, or that it was hard to have all of the things that they needed to have electronically available. So there's one comment that's like, it's rare to have the plans, engineering, and all information electronically. So again, that for the contractors, the experience seems to be a little bit different than for those of the design professionals. Same thing in terms of contractors submitting plans online. 44% say they never submit them online, sometimes 24%. So that's a huge number of them that are not submitting plans online. And only in this case, about 30% who are sometimes doing it, only 11% said that they always submit plans online. So again, really different from the design professionals, the contractor experience. And again, that may have to do with some of the things that folks are struggling with in terms of the how often they want to do that. I don't know. Anybody have any thoughts about that? Is it because they're mostly working with design professionals who are doing that work on their behalf, or anybody have thoughts about that?
One thing that we see sometimes with contractors submitting electronic files is they're often submitting drawing files that they did not themselves prepare and that may be secured, and that they do not have the ability to change the security of those files. And so it becomes a pain for them. And that's an issue for us because we can't stamp anything that is secured. And so that's they want us to stamp it. They have to give us a PDF that we can stamp.
Gotcha. Okay. And you can't, because you can't even mark those up, right? Yeah, never mind stamp them. So, okay, so that's also something to, and so, and there's no option for them to be able to have that worked. They're secured by the person who provided it, the architect or the engineer.
So they have three choices at that point. They can go back to the source and get different PDFs. They can print the PDFs out and then scan them, or they can submit by paper. And those two latter are basically just traditional means of submitting something, right? I mean, if you submit a scanned thing, it's really not any different than having submitted the paper. It's less good for us, but it's a file we can work with.
Yep. Okay, well, and that may be something, to flag for folks as we create materials, or as there are maybe best practice best practice guides for folks on submitting plans to include information like that for the contractors.
I think
Anybody else?
if I would just say that including that information for the design professionals is probably the most critical, because they're the ones who are used to securing the PDFs. They have a lot of legitimate concerns that cause them to do that.
Yep.
But when they're submitting files to a jurisdiction, they're certifying to the jurisdiction that they are the responsible parties, and they want us to stamp them. And so there has to be something that gives in order for that to happen. The jurisdiction is unlikely to be the entity that they're concerned about with regard to securing the files. So I think that there needs to be some consensus built in communication happening along those lines.
And that could be a good, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, to build on what Joel's saying, it's more than just stamping. So, we've seen just the generic stamping issue, which slowly we've been able to get that out of. It's more the trust manufacturers that are the holdovers, because often they're out of state, the actual engineer, and then they're not quite on board yet. But what we're also seeing is also just generic permissions within a stamped document. So they're allowing us to stamp, but they're not allowing us to combine or anything like that. So if your EDR system is combining that final document together, so that way it's an actual package of here's your approved plan set, similar to what we'd do for the approved paper plans, we're running into problems that way too. So it is really setting up a less best practice, more, for statewide consistency. Here's what we need. And some of that would be BCD needing to work with Osbill, because that's where we originally had that problem, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, when they came out with their rules around digital stamps. They, unlike the architects board, they came out and said it had to be a verifiable stamp. So they couldn't give us a flat stamp.
I think that for definitely a work group where we discuss, more of the details of trying to create consistency, then including both the architects and the engineers board in that discussion, for, again, them working on some of this best practice stuff for their community, and trying to reach some consensus about that, I think is a good idea. And yes, like you said, Jonathan, too, also talking about the issue of the stamps and the electronic signatures, and where can we update that or keep that in more workable for the current world that we have. So any other thoughts about electronic plan review? Sorry, in terms for the contractors and some of the barriers that might be there? All right, let's see, moving through, they had some comparable kind of comments about electronic plan review and consistency between jurisdictions. File naming conventions was one that they wanted to see, although there was more about file format, and I'm not sure of that they were talking about whether they were talking so much about PDF versus CAD as potentially maybe how you upload that. Is it a single sheet, is it group, that kind of thing. But again, that would be something to continue to have discussions about. There were more things from the contractors about knowing the requirements of everything that was required to be submitted and the numbers of forms that needed to be submitted. And that's a little bit different than a discussion about electronic plan review. That might be a bigger discussion just about kind of electronic best practices of different forms, or how to make the process a little bit smoother for customers. So, we then also asked some questions about notifications, and this was a place in terms of, this is still about plan review, kind of asking what things they saw about communications. And there was a lot of saying that communication could be a little bit better, whether it's having making sure that they get automatic email notices, or making sure that there's a mechanism by which they know, what's happening in the review, or, whether things have been approved, whether they need to provide additional information, feeling that sometimes it's been difficult for them to know that. So again, something that can be discussed as some best practices of things to institute or to learn from jurisdictions that are succeeding with that. So we asked some, there was also a big difference in terms of clearly the technical capabilities of the contractors versus the design professionals in terms of abilities to be able to print things on a large format and being able to print in color versus black and white. So the design professionals could all print in large sizes and could do color and black and white. Many fewer of the design professionals could print anything over 8x10. And a lot fewer of them could actually print in color. Now, of course, everybody can go to a print shop and have large size things printed out or things printed in color, but just having ready access to that, it's not as available to the contractors as it is to the design professionals. Also kind of a little surprising. So then we moved over into talking about things like scheduling inspections. And there's, similar to, there's a pretty big number of people. I was kind of surprised. Well, I'm not really surprised, but there are quite a few folks, a third of people still prefer to schedule by telephone, not by automated phone, but by calling up and either leaving a message on a scheduling line, versus 30% who like to do it on a website, 40% do it in person, 21% are using apps, and 13% are using automated voice scheduling. And I know for at least in e-permitting that we have, obviously for e-permitting, we offer online mobile app and automated voice scheduling, but we still have some jurisdictions, mostly some of the smaller ones, probably some of the ones who answered on the survey, that they still like to keep in, personal contact with their contractors and their community, who, even though they have those electronic means, they still keep their voicemail or their in-office, in-person scheduling as an option, and don't necessarily push people like some of the larger jurisdictions do to using the automated mechanisms. And anybody have different experiences or anything to add about that from the jurisdictional perspective? No. Okay. In terms of people, where things were doing, whether contractors had a particular place where they like to do business, there were quite a few different places that people liked. So there wasn't the same kind of consistency, where Eugene, you got quite a few shout outs for plan review. In terms of permitting system, there were a number of different entities that were mentioned as having a good system. So I don't think we got any we didn't get anybody that was like particularly like here's one entity doing it just right. We also asked, actually in both surveys, how folks would like to receive training about electronic systems and electronic processes. And the number one feedback, no surprise, is that if you have to have training, it's not easy enough, which is, it's probably, it's true. Ideally one wouldn't need training to use a system, or on the other hand, I think that the difficulty is that as we build permitting systems, or we have electronic plan review systems, that we're regulatory agencies, and the ability to streamline it and make it perfectly simple just isn't entirely there, because there's a complexity of what we have to do that makes it difficult to try to make it completely simple for somebody to use that. But it's certainly something to strive for. And of the folks who did say that they what they would use for training materials, it was kind of a mix between people who liked videos and people who liked handouts with visuals that went with it. So that's a kind of, good to know as and if we need to create information. And then we asked people to kind of rate and rank what was most important to people. And this one, in the contractors in a permitting system, this was kind of interesting in that permit applications came out as #1, and then inspection scheduling, plan submittal, permit updates, payments, plan markup and review, and receiving inspection results was the last one, which actually was a surprise to me. My understanding was that there was a big, that contractors really appreciated getting real-time inspection results through electronic systems. That ability to do that was a big time and money saver. And it's interesting that #1 is permit applications when so many of the contractors aren't actually doing online applications. So I don't know, that may be something that we want to explore a little bit further with the contractors as to where that disjuncture is coming from. Anybody have any thoughts about that? Anything you noticed or kind of jumped into your mind as you looked at that data? No? Okay. Well, that's kind of the overview of those 2 surveys, from which I think, we definitely have the follow-up of a work group for talking about electronic plans and electronic plan review processes, and potentially down the line, as we're looking at some more best practice things, maybe involving the contractors and trying to dig into a little bit of kind of where that disjuncture is between folks not applying online and yet putting permit applications as one of the more important features for them to have. So that's something, again, to see if we can kind of dig into a little bit. Just any thought about anything additional about the work groups? Any comments, thoughts, questions, anything we've missed on that? Nope. Okay. Then I want to talk, so next we kind of have like next steps. Obviously, in terms of the work groups, we have a next step of an additional work group to discuss electronic plan review, electronic signatures, et cetera. So that's something that we will look at scheduling. But the next kind of, obviously this rulemaking committee is about the 2415 bill that passed, which requires obviously all jurisdictions to be on e-permitting or something comparable by 2025. And we, I think initially we're thinking about having rulemaking to define a comparable system. However, if we look at the actual bill language itself, it actually provides a lot of what an electronic plan system has to have, whether it's e-permitting or another system. And I'd like to kind of go through, you have access to this on the 2415 bill language was provided in the email for this, but I'll kind of go through the language. And it's actually part of the statute. So it was an amendment to ORS 455.095. And it says that the information, so this is what the e-permitting system must have, which again would mean that a comparable system must also have it. So it says that an e-permitting system must have, but not be limited to having, licensing, permit, inspection, and other relevant information, access to forms, electronic submission of, and this is what's added, and payment for permit applications, electronic submission of plans for review, electronic receipt of plan approvals and permits, electronic issuance of minor label or other appropriate permits, access to permit and inspection processes, receiving requests for and scheduling inspections, tracking of corrections and granting of approvals, and performance of electronic field inspections, construction progress inspections, and on-site verification of compliance with building codes requirements, and the coordination and tracking of construction-related services. So to me, this, currently, so this is easy and that e-permitting does this stuff already. But to me, that's a fairly comprehensive list of what an electronic system would need to have. So one of the questions I wanted to throw out to the group was how much benefit you think there is to defining some of the terms within that versus just this is what a comparable system must contain, and then putting together some best practice guides as guidance for how we fill in some of the details of what those things look like. So thoughts?
Well, I think obviously it would be good to define some of those things, especially if, BCD is going down the intent that they had originally said is we're not making a state model. That's what we're having to adopt. But like Joel and Eugene, has to have a comparable system that can perform the things that BCD wants to meet the intent of the bill. So, obviously some of that can be defined to make it clearer for the jurisdictions, like even ourselves, who decided to stick with Acela, but have our own host system. So that way we can manipulate it a little bit more. So that way we stay in compliance without walking away too far from what BCD and the REC's intent was.
So of those terms, Jonathan, do you have a specific a set of them that you think need more, are there particular ones that you think are more ambiguous than others of that, or do you really think it benefits all of it?
I think the big, what is electronic probably needs some type of definition, kind of where we started a long time ago. We were, saying, why do we still have a rule that you guys thankfully fixed that says I have to have a fax? Technically, that is an electronic means of communication. So, is that adequate type thing? So what is the intent? So it may behoove the group and the customer group so they understand what is electronic. But the bigger one for me for the definition really is the ambiguity of the bill and this virtual inspection. That's the one I think needs the bigger definition for.
The performance of electronic field inspections?
Yeah.
Okay. Meaning like, so for currently for you all, do you use any kind of mobile app or mobile, a laptop in the field to perform result inspections?
So yeah, so for like us, we using Acela, we'll use their mobile inspector app, and then we result. That's our expectation is before we leave the job site, or before we leave the the street, we already result the inspection. So that way they get an email, a real-time email notification, basically as we're driving away, of what their results were. So that way they can forward it on or take care of those elements. So if that's all the intent, then that's awesome. If the reality is to do more of the what Warren's doing with the minor label program and allowing some type of video inspection, if that's BCD's intent, we need to make sure that that's clear so everybody knows what is the the virtual electronic inspection.
Gotcha. Yeah, I assumed that, I didn't assume that means that we're doing video inspection. The requirement to me, I think, is the real-time requirement. But then, if there is some ambiguity there, I do think that there is some benefit to talking about and developing best practices around the video inspections. We permitting just rolled out, our app does have video inspections, but I don't know that I think there's a lot to be worked out on what's appropriate for video inspections, how they work. And I don't know that it would be, I think there's some work to be done to figure out what the standard should be around that, and that will probably be a work in progress for a while. So.
Oh, I agree, especially being one of the pilot programs for the mechanical minor label, and we've had zero because they've been struggling to get everybody on board with how to do it. So it will definitely be a learning curve one. That's why for me that one's the one that is the bigger. Let's define what this means to make sure everybody knows what it means.
Well, and I think the lesson learned from the mechanical minor labels was just that that it's not, the technology isn't, for the contractors, it was, they really did not want to use the app to have to document what they were doing, that took away some of the efficiency of what they, the benefits of the minor label, which has something to do with the speed of usage and, all of that. And so I think there was, yeah, definitely lessons learned from that, and things to be looking at as we move forward using the technology. So, and we had some suggestions on things that did make more sense perhaps for video stuff, like some of the utility inspections, how you might use those video inspections to kind of for things that were, more straightforward types of checks on things. So anybody else have thoughts about other things, about rulemaking around that, other terms that they think require more definition from that statutory language? So not so much. In terms of best practice things and consistency, so we've talked a lot about, obviously, electronic plan review. I personally have some thoughts of things that we do in e-permitting that I would love to see as statewide consistent things, but would love to get a sense from jurisdictions that are not e-permitting jurisdictions as to whether that might be something that, you would perceive the benefit of and that might be doable. So one of the things that we kind of started for our jurisdictions for a long time ago is just having one consistent named list of inspections that everybody uses, which made it easier for the contractors to be able to identify what they're doing. And so as they go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the list of those inspection names is the same. Any thoughts on that and the potential of that potentially being something that we could adopt as a statewide standard?
I think there's benefit to that. One of the things that, working in the two jurisdictions in semi-similar capacities, we often got complaints about was, well, your naming's different. I don't know what inspection I'm going to request. I don't know what inspections I need, so on and so forth. So whether or not it's a requirement, but a best practices guidance would be great for the jurisdictions to do, so it's more consistent between everybody. Because it's like you've struggle even between the disciplines. Plumbing, we call it a top out, everybody else we call it a rough in, or a rough inspection. So it's kind of even crazy between the trades.
Yeah, I mean, and as we also did a cleanup of our inspections with our e-permitting jurisdictions, the building officials having some discussions about how to use different types of inspections. I could see that also as being a benefit, is putting guides out there. The more consistency there is, or as a best practice, you name things here, and these are what are covered. This is when you use a rough plumbing inspection, right? Or this is where this type of inspection translates into this kind of thing. So that, again, providing some of that guidance to folks and having that a bit, as a resource that people have access to be able to figure out what they need to schedule, or those homeowners, right? Oftentimes contractors ask the homeowners to schedule those inspections, and they sometimes don't know what they need to schedule. So, any other thoughts about that in terms of from anybody else in terms of naming of inspections? The only other thought I have in terms of that, in terms of consistency of something that we do that I think could be helpful to folks, and whether it's a best practice or a requirement, would be something for us all to discuss. But one thing that we do for jurisdictions that come onto e-permitting is we have a consistent naming of all of the mechanical fixtures, trying to align it with the code. And often we, if somebody comes onto it and they have some weird names for mechanical fixtures or obsolete names, or, and just having everything named the same as you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, again, seems like a consistency that's fairly straightforward to do. And I think is helpful to the mechanical contractors, somewhat to the plumbing contractors as well. Any thoughts on that one? New? All righty. Well, so we can look at potentially having some discussions about those two items. So we have, it sounds like a recommendation for doing some rulemaking to, and obviously having some discussion as a committee to discuss defining some of the terms that are in the statute, putting together rules to define an electronic system and what electronic means, potentially what field inspection means, and maybe some of those other terms within that. As we start to dig into them, we'll benefit from a little bit of definition. We also probably have some work to do, either coming out of the work group with electronic plan review, which we will go to schedule, but probably looking through the rules to see if there are some obsolete requirements that go along with electronic systems. So places where we have requirements for signatures, perhaps, whether those are architect signatures, the locking of those things, or whether those are signatures on permits that, again, probably need to be amended to make sure that we have an electronic means of dealing with that. And any other place in the rules. I think we have done, I think one of our policy analysts has done kind of like a cursory look at the rules at some places where we may want to update things to better align them with electronic processes. And that would be something for the rulemaking committee to discuss. So I think those are probably our next steps, would be to, one, put together a work group to discuss some of the best practices around electronic plan review. And then two, to put together, or to have the rulemaking committee meet on and work on some of the definitions of the terms of an electronic system. Anything else? Any comments, thoughts? Terry, anything else on your side of things?
I don't see anything further. I just have your notes here, and I will probably get an email out. And what do you think, Selena, in the next 2 weeks on the work group and the rulemaking committee?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep, definitely. Well, thank you so much for everybody's participation and for all the work that has been done so far. For those folks who participated in the work groups, I think we got some good information out of that, a couple of tasks and some things that I think will be useful going forward. I think the information coming out of the surveys will also be helpful as we move forward with putting together some best practices and implementing the definitions that go along with the rulemaking to implement the bill. So thank you, everybody. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day, and we'll look forward to meeting again sometime not too far in the future as we proceed with the next steps.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.